Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And now, here are your hosts, Scott and Jesse from CompassKnox.com.
Hello and welcome to Compass Points, the podcast where every week we talk about Knoxville government, politics, education, business, really anything that gets our attention. I'm Jesse Mayshark, co-founder and co-publisher of Compass at CompassKnox.com. I'm joined, as always, by Scott Barker, also co-publisher and co-founder of Compass. How are you doing today, Scott?
I am doing fine, except we're in the middle of budget season, and I have nothing in my brain but numbers.
I hear you. So we're recording this on Friday morning. I just came from a little budget preview briefing with Knox County officials. We're going to be talking about that a little bit later on. So yes, lots of budget numbers floating around. And as we talk about these things over the coming weeks, we will do our best to try to keep those numbers straight, especially when we're talking about them on the podcast where you can't go back and refer to them.
Right. Yeah. You can't proofread a podcast, so
yeah. If we make any misstatements, we will be sure to correct ourselves. We're taping this on Friday. Today is May 5th, which means it is Cinco de Mayo. Mm-hmm. So I hope everybody's out there celebrating that in whatever way. I think I see a margarita on the horizon.
Surely not.
Of course, that's also just a normal Friday for me.
Yeah, really.
maybe there'll be 2 margaritas this time. We do have some things to talk about this week. We have an interview coming up with Brady Watson, who is a local progressive activist involved in several causes, and he put together was one of the organizers this past week of something called the People's State of the City, sort of an effort to give a boost to progressive causes, particularly in the city budget. We're going to talk about some very interesting discussion this week at the school board about a program that is not even a school program. It's a program called the Freedom Schools that uses school facilities during the summer. Became a bit of a hot issue at meetings this week. We are going to talk about an interesting development in the ongoing public records case against the city of Knoxville by the News Sentinel, having to do with records related to their police chief search. And to start us off, we're going to actually kind of pick up right where we left off last week. If you listened to our podcast last week, you might remember that right at the front end, we put in kind of a note that we had just been alerted that morning. So this was the previous Friday, April 28th, of a gun incident at West High School. And I wanted to talk about this a little bit just because, on the one hand, Scott, this was sort of not a big deal in the sense that when we hear about guns in schools, of course, our thoughts go to very bad places. Mm-hmm. In this particular instance, first of all, it appears that the gun was in a student's backpack, Knoxville Police Department said, a 14-year-old student, which I assume means they're a freshman, because I think by this time of year, certainly if you're 14 and you're in high school, you're probably a freshman. And it was apparently discharged accidentally. That's what KPD says. We don't really have details of exactly what happened. There's a lot of stuff floating around on social media about things that this particular student may or may not have posted leading up to this. We don't really have any firm information on that. But the gun discharged. It was a gun in his backpack in a classroom, and it went off and did not seriously injure anybody. The teacher in the room was, according to the reports, grazed by either the bullet or some shrapnel, little unclear. And, of course, they very quickly responded. School security, KPD, were, by all accounts, on the scene quite quickly. The school went into a sort of medium lockdown because they determined pretty quickly that there was not like an ongoing threat. And the student, of course, has been arrested, is facing charges. I assume will probably be facing expulsion and, various other impacts on their academic career in the near term. But it's, coming just a month after, of course, the terrible shooting at the Covenant School, and then all of the talk that we've had both at the state level and locally since then about gun safety. Governor Bill Lee still saying that he's going to call a special session to try to address some of these issues. It just kind of kept that, the idea of the threat of guns, particularly in the school setting, very, very front and center. And so I think that just because nobody got seriously hurt here doesn't mean this wasn't a serious incident.
Well, yeah, it's very disturbing. You've got a 14-year-old, as you said, is probably a freshman in high school, who's taking a gun to school.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know how he obtained the weapon. Lots of speculations. Kind of the go-to thing is he got it from his parents,
or family, or
somebody,
right?
Either probably stole it from them or whatever, but we don't know. That's pure speculation. He could have gotten an older friend or a relative to buy it for him, make a straw man purchase. That happens. And
that was the case in the Anthony Thompson Jr. case from a few years ago, where the gun that he had when he was shot and killed was one that was purchased for him by an older friend, basically.
Absolutely. Yeah. It was another straw man purchase. And that's a big issue that is really very, very difficult to prevent. And then, but just because someone was, no one was killed or seriously wounded. Although I think a shrapnel wound is enough to get you a Purple Heart if you're in the military.
Right.
I don't know the severity of that wound. Although my understanding is the teacher attended a faculty meeting that afternoon. So.
Right. They didn't have to go to the hospital.
Yeah,
or
but
of course, you could speculate about the ongoing trauma of a gun going off in your classroom. Both for the teacher and the other students who were there.
Yeah.
That doesn't. There could be other after effects.
Yeah, and there's just the sheer terror that you have to imagine that went on in that classroom for even if it's just for a few minutes. If that had happened in a high school class of mine, I would still be remembering it very vividly.
Yeah, it's a story you would probably tell over the years.
It's just another incident that points, that people who want gun reform are going to point to, just because it's not, there were no fatalities and no serious, woundings doesn't mean that it wasn't a serious incident. And it goes to the point of how easy it is to obtain weapons, how easy it is to get them into schools. We don't know what this student's intent was. For all we know, it went off accidentally. He may have had an intent to use it purposefully later in the day. We don't know. And so while I think people are universally and rightfully thankful that nothing bad happened, you can't ignore the fact that something much worse could have easily happened.
Absolutely. And this does come as, we have had gun incidents in Knox County schools before. Sometimes people talk about, well, something could happen here. And I think it's worth remembering that things have happened here.
Yes.
Of course, we did have the shooting of Anthony Thompson Jr. by a KPD officer in 2021. But then in, I think it was 2013-ish, there was a disgruntled teacher at Inskip Elementary School, went out, I think, into the parking lot, got a gun, came back in and shot the principal and assistant principal, who both survived, thankfully. But I mean, that was a pretty serious event. And then in 2008, there was a student at Central High School who shot and killed another student in the school cafeteria. So we have had, gun violence in Knox County schools. And this is another instance of that. And in each of those prior instances, they have led to discussions about, do the schools need to do more from a security standpoint? Hearing some of that around this one, not at the official level, but just a lot of parents on social media. And, the question that often comes up here is, do we need metal detectors? That's kind of the obvious thing people go to because, as you say, it is, in fact, pretty easy to put all sorts of things in your backpack and walk in the door in the morning. And Superintendent John Ryswick at a news conference after this event happened at West High School, he was asked about that. And, he was cautious about it. He said that, the balance there is always wanting schools to be safe, but also wanting them to be welcoming and to feel like a safe place. And there's a danger in kind of like, if you put too many safety measures in place, the place itself kind of starts to feel less safe, starts to feel more like, as he said, you don't want it to feel like a prison that you're coming into in the morning. I think there is also a serious logistical question there about, like, if you put metal detectors in every school in Knox County, the amount of time it's going to take in the morning every day for, some of our schools that have upwards of 1,500 to 2,000 students coming through metal detectors every morning and being, because you can't just have metal detectors, you have to have people at the metal detectors actually responding to them and using them for screening. So it would obviously be both a major investment for the school system, but also it could have some real logistical challenges. And there was at this week's school board meetings, they did talk about this incident, but nobody talked about that. Like, do we need to put metal detectors or anything? So I don't know if that particular conversation will come back here, but, I will say on a personal note, my own, one of my kids attends West High School, was there when this happened. He, fortunately, this was not in his classroom. He was in a completely different part of the campus at the time and was more confused than anything else by the sort of information that they got. And then eventually they were all sent home early. I think I've talked to some other parents about this. I think it was something that maybe disturbed the parents more than some of the students to some degree. Although another parent I know who also has a child there made the point that, well, like, either our kids are going to be traumatized by this or they're going to be fine with it because it's something they sort of expect to happen, and that's kind of troubling either way. Whatever impact it has on our kids is not, it's not something that you can feel good about as a parent. So anyway, that happened. We just wanted to follow up on it because we did talk about it briefly last week, and we'll see if anything else comes out of this particular incident.
I will say that Ryswick's response, I think, shows he might be a little out of touch because kids already look at school as prisons. At least I did. Yeah. No, I'm a kid, of course. You're right. You're. I think the idea that you're in a fortress, while while a fortress is supposed to technically be safe, it also assumes there will be attacks,
right?
And I know, and everybody, all the old people our age say, well, we never had this in our schools when we were growing up, and we didn't.
Yeah.
And so we didn't even think about anything like this. So, we came and went as we pleased at our school. When I was in high school, there was no, people brought hunting rifles in their trucks and things like that. Of course, I was in a more rural school, but it's a different time now, and it's a real shame that we feel like we have to turn our schools into fortresses.
Mm-hmm.
And, it may end up being that is exactly what ends up happening. But we'll see if there are measures to be taken, if the legislature does indeed meet in special session to see if what, if anything, might come out of that.
Yep, for sure. All right, well, let's turn to Mayor India Kincannon and her administration's decision this past week to release a bunch of records from their police chief search that they have spent basically the past year trying very hard not to release. So what happened here, Scott?
Yeah, last year, KPD or the city of Knoxville was conducted a nationwide search for a new police chief to replace Eve Thomas, who retired. It ended just about exactly a year ago with the hiring of Paul Noel. But the search itself is what kind of generated this controversy. The city held public meetings to try to get input from citizens about what they would want to see from the next police chief. The qualities they might have, things to priorities that they might share, and those kinds of things. But then they turned the search itself over to the Police Executive Research Forum, which is a nonprofit, obviously focused on law enforcement, and they carefully conducted the search so that city officials themselves did not have any records. All the records, all the resumes, everything went to PERF. It's the acronym for the organization.
Right. I mean, the city was very deliberately conducting an anonymous search. A search where they were telling applicants that their names would not be made public just because they were applying for the job.
Right. The idea behind this is that people might be, qualified candidates might be reluctant to apply because they might get, retribution at their jobs, current jobs. These are all. Do you expect most of the people to apply to be a police chief at a police department the size of Knoxville would be high-ranking people in their own organizations, easily kicked to the curb if they incurred the ire of their chiefs, or in some cases their mayors, because police chiefs from other agencies applied for the job. And in fact, Noel himself, he went through a more public process when Chattanooga was doing its police chief search, and he was a finalist there. The finalists, I believe, were interviewed publicly by city council, and he said, "I'm not doing that again." He said, if this had not been, if candidates had not been given confidentiality, he would not have applied for the Knoxville job. So anyway, Kincannon named him the chief. Mayor Kincannon did, and the News Sentinel editor Joel Christopher filed a lawsuit alleging that they violated the Public Records Act because they would not turn over the resumes and other information about the applicants and about the search. The city has been fighting that in court. And
they are facing potential depositions in that case,
yes,
which could include people all the way up to the mayor having to actually sit for depositions.
Right. And the judge had said, they're going to have to sit for depositions and all. So what the city did recently is they reached out to PERF and said, we would like to release the names of candidates, but we know we have given them an assurance of confidentiality. But if you get permission from them, we will release their names. So it's been a year. Obviously, a lot of these people were looking for other jobs anyway, and Perf contacted each of the candidates, and there were 39 of them. We'd already known that. There were 39 candidates. They contacted all 39. All 39 said that by now it's okay. You can release our names. A lot of them have taken jobs elsewhere or been promoted. There was one candidate from Chattanooga who was promoted to an assistant chief's job down there. There was a police chief from Birmingham who got hired as a police chief in Vancouver, Washington. So, I mean, there were, they all moved, some probably retired, others just moved on to different jobs. So, whatever their circumstances were, they all agreed to do this. So the city last Monday released a list of names and their resumes to the public, and filed a motion in Chancery Court saying that by doing so they've rendered the complaint that Joel Christopher filed as moot. So it's there is not a dispute anymore because we've provided this which they wanted. We've given them every other document that's in our possession that would be responsive to their open records request, and so we think you should dismiss the case. So that's under consideration now,
but the News Sentinel doesn't want to dismiss the case, right? Because they say that this is not just about having the records, but it's the kind of principle of the city trying to use a third-party contractor to kind of circumvent public records.
Yeah, absolutely. I talked to Joel Christopher Monday after these records were released. There's a little side note there. The city apparently hand-delivered this information to the News Sentinel's legal representative on Monday afternoon. They sent it to the other media who had requested the same, and we all requested the same information. They sent that to the rest of us electronically, but apparently because of the litigation that was involved, they went through the attorney, the News Sentinel's attorney, to give them that stuff, and it didn't make it to the News Sentinel. They were kind of taken aback when I called and started asking about it.
Right. So, I mean,
but anyway,
basically the city, those of us who asked for the information but didn't sue the city got it before the people who actually sued the city got it. And the city can say that wasn't intentional or anything, but I also kind of doubt that the city was really upset about the fact that the News Sentinel got it after all the rest of us did.
Probably not. They said that they delivered it before to the News Sentinel's attorney before they sent it out to the rest of the media. But of course, you don't know. I mean, you deliver something to a law office, the reception person and the receptionist and the whatever, they may not look at it. They may throw it in an in basket and they get around to looking at it later. Who knows? But whatever the case was, the News Sentinel didn't get it directly, and at least before the rest of us did, which is highly unusual. But when I talked to Joel Christopher, he said that we really don't care, who the identities of the applicants. What matters is the process, and that we think that if they get away with the city gets away with doing a search like this without transparency, then they will do so again in the future with other positions, high, especially these high level positions where they would consider getting someone who's outside of the was an external candidate, and so that's the one thing that he emphasized he wanted to prevent that. One of the issues now, of course, is whether the judge is going to dismiss the lawsuit or not. One of the bedrock principles of civil law in Tennessee is if there's not a dispute, then there's not a case. They don't just take cases to answer hypothetical situations or theoretical, resolve theoretical disputes. It's got to be a real, actual legal dispute. And if the judge rules that this is on the city's favor and rules that this is indeed moot, then that will end it. Yeah. Now, the judge may not rule that it's moot, so that's one of the things that you'll keep tabs on and see what what actually ends up happening with that.
Well, and I think you could speculate that even if the case does get dismissed, the fact that there was this lawsuit that got at least enough traction in court. I mean, he didn't. The city tried to get the case dismissed, and the judge did not go along with that, and it was going to proceed, and I guess still could theoretically, to actual depositions of city officials. All of that together, even if it gets dismissed at this point, could still serve as kind of a deterrent to future mayors in undertaking this kind of search, because do you really want to take on that big potential legal battle? Yeah,
and one thing that kind of came out in all this is there was a similar situation in Memphis several years ago, and Memphis undertook a very similar approach. I have not looked into the ins and outs of the approach that Memphis took in their police chief search and see, compare, contrast with Knoxville's. But the city of Knoxville did say that they patted it on that, and the state court of appeals, the commercial appeal, the Memphis newspaper was sued over that one. The court of appeals ruled that the search was okay. Like I said, in legal situations, the devil's in the details, and I don't know the details of that. And in fact, I think that's one of those, if I'm not mistaken, it's one of those unpublished opinions that you just somehow they get away with not publishing court opinions, and sometimes, and so it's obviously not binding because it's a court of appeals decision that's in the Western District. So so we'll I think that certainly it could act as a deterrent. It could act as a green light for these types of searches. But one thing is that it's got to be noted is these types of searches are very rare. Mm-hmm.
People have, in general, especially with police chiefs and the high visibility of that position, the controversy that can come with it, cities mostly have moved toward more public search processes.
Well, and typically in Knoxville, they've hired from within, so they don't advertise anything. They just go down the hall to somebody's office and interview somebody down there. Say, hey, you want to be chief? Yeah. In fact, the only time that I know of that KPD hired an outside person was Sterling Owen in the first part of this century, and even he was, he was a federal law enforcement officer here in Knoxville and was very well known and very well respected here. And they didn't do a nationwide search; they just basically called Sterling up and said, "Hey, you want to apply for this job?" And
right, and there is no real legal requirement. The police chief works for the mayor. The mayor, a mayor can just go and hire a police chief. They're not legally required to go through any particular steps to do that.
That's true. They're not required to, but they are required to. If they create records, they are required to make those available to the public, and that's what the lawsuit was about.
Right.
And but yeah, it could embolden them. But most of these basically the police chief is a department head. And I can't think of, Harold Cannon is a department head who came from outside. It wasn't a nationwide search. They talked to Harold Cannon about being the engineering director.
Right.
And he's now the economic development director. So it's not, Chief Sharp is the fire chief was promoted from within. Eve Thomas, the Noel's predecessor, was promoted from within. Most people who get to those positions are promoted from within. So the likelihood of a similar search being conducted anytime soon is slim. And one of the things too that Noel has said is one of his goals is to build up the command staff in such a way that when his successor is made, when he retires, that the mayor at that time can promote from within.
We'll have good candidates
Yeah.
to choose from, right?
Yeah.
Well, so legal and philosophical questions aside, did we learn anything particularly interesting from the list of candidates? Anything jump out?
Well, it was a pretty diverse pool. There were only 2 women who applied. There were 39 applicants from 23 states, 8 of them from Tennessee, which was the most, but which you would probably expect. But they were from all over the place. We had 10 of them were police chiefs from existing, at the time that they applied. We had several candidates who were command staff level at large police departments like Miami-Dade, DeKalb County in Georgia, which is part of Metro Atlanta, the Chicago Police Department. Noel was one of 2 who applied from the New Orleans Police Department. So there was a big pool. They didn't give a breakdown race, but I went through. Of course, I haven't gone back and looked through all of them, but I did a random search through the names because we got this Monday afternoon and turned around and wrote a story for Tuesday. Did a random search through there, and there were quite a few African American applicants. One of the women was an African American woman. So they did have a diverse pool of applicants. Interesting thing is a lot of the applicants did get have gotten better jobs since, because there was one from Texas who was the interim police chief at a department outside of Houston, which sounds big, but you did a Google thing on the town that was and it's a dirt road. She had been in the Houston Police Department though, and had been a commander in the Houston Police Department, and she's got a new job in Aurora, California, which is a pretty decent sized agency. So, they appear to have been a fairly accomplished group of applicants, and I haven't gone through every single resume, but most of them, seem to be qualified. There were a couple that were heads of private security services. One was at a medical group, hospital group. One was at basically a private security firm. But for the most part, these were active professional commanders.
Mm-hmm. So. But no sort of smoking gun that jumps out like, how could they hire Chief Noel instead of this amazing candidate?
No. I mean, there were several who were qualified. I mean, who had similar qualifications. But I think that one of the things that is one of the reasons that they decided to do a nationwide search is they wanted to get a chief who would be able to change the culture at KPD because of KPD's recent history of well, not necessarily recent, but history of the racial and sexual issues with
they've had issues.
I
think we can just say they've had issues.
They've had issues, and Noel has a reputation for that. He had a track record of bringing in outside resources for training. In fact, they've got the one of the the things that there's always a complaint of the police of is one officer will be doing something that is outside the bounds, and the other officers won't report him to superiors or won't intervene and try to stop the person from doing it. And Noel has contracted with an organization to do bystander intervention training, and it just started. They just last week started training the command staff on that. And and one of the things that comes up, and this comes up in the other thing that we'll be talking about here in a few minutes, was the People's State of the City, was the culture doesn't seem to have changed yet.
Right.
Well, I think it takes time for it to change, and they haven't even. They're just now starting this kind of training, and I think that it will take a while before all officers get trained, and all of the officers will be trained in it eventually. But
right.
We got over 300, almost 400 officers. So
yeah, and so whether that really does seem to have any effect, it'll be a while.
We won't know for a long time whether it's effective or not.
Yep. All right. Well, interesting thing at the school board this week, and it was an item. So the school board had their monthly meetings, their work session on Monday, their voting meeting on Thursday, and I have to say that looking at the agenda on the front end, it looked pretty, not super exciting to me. There was nothing on that agenda that made me think I was going to be sitting through a nearly 5-hour meeting on Thursday. However, this is why we go to the meetings, because you never know what's going to happen. And there was one item on the agenda, which was an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, between the school system and an outside independent nonprofit organization called East Tennessee Freedom Schools, which runs a summer program called Freedom Schools. And they've been doing this for 6 years. There have been other organizations in the past that have also run Freedom School programs. This particular one has been operating for about 6 years. And the Freedom Schools model is something that was developed by a national nonprofit called the Children's Defense Fund, fairly well-known, created in 1973 by civil rights pioneer Marian Wright Edelman, who some people may know. She was quite close with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., worked on his People's campaign sort of toward the end of his life, and then after he was killed, she created Children's Defense Fund, particularly to advocate for the needs of children of color, poor children, children with disabilities. And this is what CDF has been doing for the past 50 years. One of the things they do is they created this Freedom Schools model of summer programs to try to address the longstanding issue of sort of summer learning loss that people talk about that happens with kids, particularly maybe with lower income kids who aren't necessarily in households where, say, people are reading to them every day or they themselves are reading every day. And so that's the biggest thrust of this program is for elementary students to really build and retain their reading skills and build on them so that they're able to go into the next school year, even better shape than they were at the end of the previous one. And there have been no complaints about this program. It has been operating in 2 Knox County school buildings for the past 6 years. This year it's expanding to 3, and that is not unusual. Lots of outside groups have facilities use agreements with Knox County Schools. Legally, public school systems have to make their buildings available to community groups to use. And also legally, they cannot discriminate. There's a lot of court case precedent on this. They can't discriminate against anybody using their facility just because they don't like their point of view, they don't like their politics, they don't like their religion, none of that. They basically, any restrictions on use of facilities has to be what they call content neutral. Mm-hmm. So, they can have some basic requirements, but it's got to just treat everybody the same. So this MOU was adding just a little bit to that program, basically a data sharing agreement with Knox County Schools so that the Freedom Schools people can kind of get information about where are these students at, like the kids who are coming to our program, what's our most recent academic information on them so that we can know where they're at and then kind of gauge how they do over the course of the Freedom Schools. And the school system, this was said during the discussion, has these data sharing agreements with some other local nonprofit organizations too, for the same reason. They're all serving the same kids, and so they're kind of trying to just, kind of be able to track that student progress. And then the other part of it was a transportation agreement that basically just said Knox County Schools already runs its own summer programs, and of course those are being bolstered this year in particular because of the new third grade reading law and the fact that there's going to be a whole bunch of kids coming out of third grade who are going to be required to go to summer programs. So they're going to have summer programs at a lot of schools, including these 3 schools that Freedom Schools will also be operating in. And this agreement just said that in neighborhoods where we are already running buses that are already going to these schools and the buses have some extra capacity, the kids who are going to the Freedom Schools can go ahead and get on the bus and come to the school. That's really all it says. No expenditure of extra money by the school system. Basically, the Freedom Schools don't cost Knox County anything. They're supported by private donations and grants. And they also don't cost anything for the kids who participate in them. They are free because, again, they're serving very explicitly. They're serving low-income kids. And to be really specific, they're mostly serving poor African-American kids. They said 80% of the kids in the program typically are black. 90% of them typically are lower income. So that's really who they're serving. And nobody had raised any concerns or issues about this until at Monday's work session, a couple of board members in the Republican majority of the board, raised concerns about the program, not even so much about the Freedom Schools themselves as about the Children's Defense Fund. Steve Triplett, Republican representative from the Halls-Powell area, raised concerns about a blog post that he read on the Children's Defense Fund website that was about Banned Books Month, where they had a book where they were, encouraging. They had a sort of list of books that had been frequently banned in other places that they were using in their programs to say that these are books that, because a lot of books that get banned in different school systems and places around the country, as we know, are often books about or by racial minorities, LGBTQ, minorities of all kinds. Those are the most common books to get challenged. And so there was a blog post on the Children's Defense Fund site that basically just said that. These are the kinds of books that get challenged the most. Yeah. And then they also had a list of books that are often banned that they themselves do use in their Freedom Schools. And so Steve Triplett really focused on just really a couple of phrases from this one blog post, that the fact that it even mentioned that X% of books that get banned because of sexual content. They weren't saying, and those are the books we're going to teach to your kids. That was something that came from PEN America, the writers group and freedom of expression group. They were just quoting their statistics, but Steve Triplett said that phrase several times: sexual content, sexual content, sexual content. He said LGBTQ several times, even though, again, the Freedom Schools, they may have some books that have some LGBTQ characters in them and that they teach or something, but that's not really their focus either. But, he was very, I think, deliberately quoting from, again, one blog post about, some statistics about banned books. But he just said that phrase a lot: sexual content, LGBTQ, and then said, I can't support this. He actually cited the Bible. He said, I believe in the Bible, and I believe that we can't support this. Susan Horn, board member, also raised some concerns, noted that there was a book that was based on the 1619 Project, which is a somewhat controversial book among conservatives. And, she just kind of said that she didn't feel comfortable with it. Betsy Henderson, the board vice chair, quoted a podcast from 2019 that she also found on the Children's Defense Fund website, where somebody on the podcast was talking about their programs in Tennessee and saying, and we're going to help raise the next generation of activists. Betsy Henderson didn't like that word. I don't think that's our job to teach. We're supposed to be teaching kids, not making them into activists. It may not be surprising that the Children's Defense Fund, which was founded by Marian Wright Edelman, who was herself a civil rights activist and is still alive. She's the president emerita of the organization. And the program, Freedom Schools, was somewhat based conceptually on the Freedom Riders of 1964, who came down to Mississippi and helped register black voters and also did conduct summer educational programs. It may not be surprising that a group with that background also sees instilling a certain commitment to civic action as something positive. And Denise Dean, who runs the East Tennessee Freedom Schools, in talking about the program to the school board this week, said, we are teaching our kids, yes, that it's good to make a difference in your community, that's a valuable thing. And, it's kind of interesting because there's been all this talk about civics, right? Governor Bill Lee put money in the budget to create this Civics Institute at the University of Tennessee that we've talked about. I mean, a big part of civics is actually activism, and the United States itself, you could say, was the product of a great deal of activism in the late 18th century. What's
the difference in civil action or civil engagement and activism?
Right.
They're pretty freaking close.
Well, I think that to your point, Jesse, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and all of James Madison and all, they were the activists of their time.
Yeah, I mean, the Boston Tea Party was nothing but an activist, demonstration. And, some of these board members don't have problems with all activists. Betsy Henderson was very, very supportive of the very loud, organized, and active activists against the mask mandate.
Yeah.
That was activism. So, I think sometimes people don't always say exactly what they mean.
Yeah.
I guess is what I'm saying. Nevertheless, some board members said, well, hold on a second. None of this is actually our business. This isn't a Knox County Schools program. One of the questions that got raised was, does any of the material in the program violate this prohibited concepts law that was passed in 2021 that had a list of 14 concepts you can't teach in Tennessee public schools? It's part of the public school law. And so there were some questions like, well, does any of their material violate this? And that sort of got addressed in the conversation among board members and then by people who came to the meeting on Thursday in support of the Freedom Schools. It got addressed in two different ways. One argument, which board member Jennifer Owen made, was it doesn't matter because the state law does not apply to outside private nonprofit organizations. It doesn't apply to Freedom Schools any more than it applies to the Boys and Girls Club or vacation Bible schools or anything else. This law is very clearly about the state public school curriculum, which is what the state actually has control and authority over. It doesn't matter what's in their program. That was Jennifer Owen's argument. Deputy Law Director Gary Dupler kind of said, well, if you let them ride the buses, even though it's not costing anything, that's still using school resources. So somebody could argue that you're kind of making it a de facto program, like there could be some exposure there. Now, and Dupler acknowledged that the law itself is pretty vaguely written, I think deliberately, and also that there is zero case law about this because there haven't been any violations charged under this law since it was passed. And that it's all just kind of a gray legal area. And so he basically said, well, somebody could sue you. But of course, as the law department also often says, somebody can always sue you. And in fact, people do. The school system gets sued on a not infrequent basis. And so that was kind of murky. But so then a bunch of people came, including Denise Dean, who runs the program, but also University of Tennessee professors from their College of Education who are in the business of training teachers who then, work in Knox County schools, among other places. Dr. Susan Granke, who's a professor in that program, came and talked and said that she herself has been involved in developing the curriculum for East Tennessee Freedom Schools, and she's also somebody who's involved in training teachers to go into Knox County schools. And she said, I'm very, very familiar with this state law, and I promise you 100%, like, this curriculum does not violate it. So, basically there was the argument, like, does the curriculum, or does this law even apply to the Freedom Schools curriculum? And a bunch of people thought no, but then there was also some kind of speculation that, like, well, it could. You never know. Somebody could bring a complaint and try to make that case. But then secondly, there were a bunch of people who said, well, even if it does, nothing in this curriculum, violates this in any way. And, Triplett tried to argue. He said, well, if you just look at the list of books, I think you can clearly see that some of these books violate this law. But that's not how you do that, right? Because if you want to show a violation of a law, you have to have something specific. You can't just look at a book title and say, I think that book probably violates, section 6 of this law. You have to show in a very specific way that something there really specifically violates it. And, nobody in the public discussion got to that level of alleging any particular violation. But the bigger picture of all of this, obviously, was the political divide on the Knox County School Board, which has become more pronounced as it has become a partisan board in the past year, as we've talked about. And the fact that this whole issue of what curriculum students are exposed to, concerns about so-called critical race theory and things like that, is a big hot-button topic on the kind of cultural right, has been for the past few years. And that this was really that whole framing being brought to bear on this particular summer program here in Knox County Schools that serves mostly poor Black kids, and that the school board only really had under their authority to decide whether or not they were going to let those kids ride buses that they were already running anyway, because they can't stop Freedom Schools from using their buildings. As said earlier, school boards cannot discriminate. Like, there was just a case that came out this past week. I forget what state. It might have been Pennsylvania. Or West Virginia, I think, where a group of students had formed an after-school Satan club, probably in response to an existing, Christian organization or something in the schools, and the school system had not allowed them to. And a federal judge just ruled this past week, you got to allow, if you're going to allow anybody else in, you got to let the Satanists in. The Freedom Schools is not a satanic organization, but even if they were, the school system could not stop them from using the building. So really all that was being debated here was, are you going to let poor kids ride a bus that you're running anyway to go to a summer program that there was a lot of support for? At Public Forum at Thursday's meeting, there were about 24 people who spoke. Only 3 people spoke against it. Everybody else, and it was parents who'd had kids in the program, it was people who had been counselors in the program, it was teachers. One of Knox County's own principals, the principal of Green Magnet Elementary, which is one of the sites where they do this, she came and spoke very strongly in support of the program. And again, you would think a principal probably has a grasp of what's okay under state education law and so forth. And so the result of all of that at the end of it was, by a 5-4 vote, the board did go ahead and vote to say, yes, okay, we'll do the data sharing and you can ride the buses when they are already running, which actually is only for 3 weeks of the 6-week Freedom School program, because of that's the period that it overlaps with Knox County's own program. So the other 3 weeks, Denise Dean said, they'll look for other options, people in the community or whatever, find ways to get kids to it. But it did, even though it didn't split the exact, often we've had 5-4 votes where it's kind of the 5 Republicans and then the 2 Democrats and 2 independents on the board. In this case, it was the 2 Democrats, 2 independents, kind of, I guess, the progressive wing of the board, plus board chair Christy Christie, who is a Republican, often votes with the Republican majority. But in this case, she just kind of said, we just approved a charter school because we believe in parental choice. this is a voluntary program that parents can choose to send their kids to if they want to, and we're already running the buses. I don't see any reason not to do it. So it did ultimately pass, but it kind of went from being a sort of minor item on the board agenda that everybody thought was just going to go by without discussion to a sort of minor culture war conflagration.
Yeah, and the one thing is, you're talking about how it's an independent entity doing this. I mean, these kids don't get extra credit for in the Knox County school system for going through this. All they do is they get practice reading.
Right. Well, and that was something that several board members and a lot of the people who spoke said is like, all we've been hearing in recent years is this emphasis on literacy and the importance of literacy, especially for younger children. Mm-hmm. And this is a program that is coming in and at no cost to anybody who participates in it or the school system is providing a 6-week program where kids are reading for 3 hours a day, like half the time that they're in this program, basically, they're doing reading. They also do other kinds of activities, academic things, and, physical, social, whatever. But they do a solid 3 hours of reading every single day, which is a lot. And these are a lot of them kids who might not have access to that, in any other way. And so it's kind of like, given that this is a top identified priority for the school system, for the state, and here's this organization that's been doing it for 6 years, proven model, very popular and so forth. Like, why would you not want that to happen? And so I think one thing that's going to be interesting is to see whether, I guess we should give one other little piece of background to all of this, because I was curious about kind of where did this kind of come from that people suddenly got concerned about this. I made a records request. And basically, it was local conservative political consultant Eric Wyatter, who we've talked about before. He's been a campaign manager for several local candidates. It was him. He basically, I guess, read the school board agenda and saw this, and something about it rubbed him the wrong way. He went and looked up the Children's Defense Fund website, didn't like things he saw there. And last weekend, just started sending emails to school board members, and interestingly, only to the Republican members of the school board. The other members of the school board didn't know anything about this until they showed up Monday, and suddenly some people were upset about it. And that's really what triggered the whole thing. And it was really just one guy sending some emails that turned into this whole big... again...
An activist.
And, is Eric Wyatter an activist? Heaven forfend. Anyway, I did ask Wyatter for his reaction to the vote, and he basically said he thinks that this agreement does put the school system at risk of potentially violating this state law. We won't know that unless somebody actually tries to file some kind of complaint about it, and then I guess we'll see. One of the people who did speak against it, Sherry Garrett, another activist who ran for school board last year unsuccessfully, she said that she'd been talking to State Rep John Reagan of Oak Ridge, who was the sponsor of the original Prohibited Concepts bill, and that he was very concerned and he's ready to take action if the school board approves this. So I don't know. Maybe somebody will show up at Freedom Schools and look for some kind of violation that they can file a complaint about. I think they'd have to, first of all, prove that the law applies to Freedom Schools, which seems like very much an open concept. And if it turns out that that law does apply just because of this one little transportation agreement, then I think there's going to be a lot of organizations that could potentially, suddenly find themselves subject to state curriculum guidelines just because they use school resources in some way.
Well, and one thing too, I mean, when you're talking about a complaint, whoever makes a complaint has to have standing. In this case, it's going to be a student's parents, or teacher.
Right.
And first of all, there are no Knox County teachers who are involved in this that we're aware of. I mean, it could be a part-time gig. I don't know.
Right. But not in their official capacity as Knox County teachers anyway.
One would think that the students involved and the parents involved would not complain because they're going to the so I mean I don't
and that's what they Denise Dean said several times that she's never had a complaint about she said if a parent did raise parents are provided with the list of materials. She said if a parent raised concern about a material that day, they would just, allow that kid to go do something else while they were doing that book, which is also something that Knox County Schools itself does. Parents can opt out of particular lessons if they object to things. So she said that there haven't been any complaints or concerns, but if there were, they would certainly accommodate them. So it was all kind of based on a theoretical idea that somehow this program could be subject to this state law, and also that some things in the program then could potentially violate the state law that somebody could file a complaint about, that could then lead to Knox County Schools being penalized by the state for its partnership. If any of that happens, of course, we will report on it. Okay, let's talk about the People's State of the City. And we do have an interview coming up with Brady Watson, who is one of the organizers of this. But Scott, why don't you give us some background here?
This is a kind of a progressive activist group, coalition of groups, response to Mayor India Kincannon's State of the City address, which she delivered the previous week, and unveiled her budget. And it was basically a rebuttal, I guess you could say. Various organizations had representatives at this meeting, and they talked about what they viewed as the state of the city, and what they viewed as things that needed to be addressed that Mayor Kincannon's proposed budget does not address, or doesn't sufficiently address from their point of view. And there were about a little bit more than 50 folks who showed up, and this was at the Communication Workers Union Hall in North Knoxville. And but there was no, there was no central, thing. There were a couple of themes that arose from it. One of the things is that that race and poverty continue to be major issues in the city that they don't think have been addressed very well. Police reform is a big issue. Housing is a big issue, and they want the city to take either in case of housing, for example, they want more city funds to go toward affordable housing. Mayor Kincannon's budget has $7.5 million in local dollars. There's a lot of federal dollars that go to affordable housing as well. But as far as local dollars, about $7.5 million. Last year was the record so far in those $8 million. And but these groups think that the city should do more because of the housing crunch in Knox County, where they're just apartments are apartment complexes are full. Their rents are going up, and it's there doesn't seem to be any there are a lot of apartment buildings that are being built, but it doesn't seem until they're online and people start moving into them, you're going, well, I don't you don't see it, so it doesn't help until they open. But it takes 1 to 2 years to build these things, so it takes a while. The one of the things that they think that can happen is that funding can be taken out of the police department and put toward affordable housing and some other priorities that they have. One that they've pushed pretty heavily is is called an alternative response model, alternative response team model for dealing with emergency calls that involve mental health issues. Many of the calls that go into the 911 center. They end up dispatching officers to, but they involve, drug overdoses, or seemingly behavior that would lead one to believe that someone is on drugs, suicidal ideations, things like that are they're not really necessarily criminal, but there's really no other. You call 911, and as these people pointed out, they basically got three issues: they send an ambulance, they send a fire truck, or they send a police officer. So that's what they do. Now the police department does have what they call a co-responder model. That pairs. They've got several teams, I believe 5, and maybe just 4, but 4 to 5 teams. These teams are a combination of a police officer and a behavioral health specialist from the McNabb Center. They go out as a team to respond to a lot of these calls. The idea is the McNabb Center behavioral health specialist is there, can do, if their situation needs to be de-escalated, they got training to do that. They can evaluate the person and try to get them to some kind of treatment rather than go to jail. And the officer is essentially there in case things get out of hand. That's the kind of the bottom line there. If someone is suicidal and they're in their front yard with a gun, the police officer's there. They'll still try to talk the person down. It's
right. So the alternative model just kind of removes the police officer from that.
It does. The alternative model, and several cities do this. The alternative model, instead of a police officer as part of the team, they have a medic or an EMT as part of the team to provide medical assistance if needed. And so that takes a police officer out of the equation. That and in many instances they say that this automatically de-escalates any situation because there's not the threat of incarceration or anything else. You've got a police officer there that if there is anything that comes up, that the team could call the police department if they need to, and get an officer to come to the scene. But and like I said, there are other cities that do that. The city of Knoxville has shown no inclination to do that. They like the co-responder model. McNabb Center has said that their people feel safer with the co-responder model. Although there's no statistical evidence that I've seen that indicates that one is safer than the other. They're all pretty safe. But one of the things is they would want money taken from the police department and put into a different department to run this program.
Right, because if you're going to make a change in the budget, the money has to come from somewhere.
Yeah, the way that for this year,
mm-hmm.
or for the next upcoming fiscal year, which is what this budget is for, and there are fiscal reasons. I think that the city likes to do it this way. First of all, they've already got officers on the payroll, and to do an alternative response thing, you've got to hire EMTs and or medics, and the fire department is no inclination to do this whatsoever. They have EMTs too, but they would have to hire more if you even got the fire department involved. They'd have to hire more, but have to hire these EMTs to be involved. You also have to get vehicles, and in many cases they would have to be equipped, very least radios, and then other equipment that the team would need. Whereas with the current co-responder model. You've already got Knoxville Police Department vehicles. I think they use mostly unmarked vehicles, but they, it would be a lot more. There are a lot of expenses involved in setting up a program like this from scratch, and the city just has no inclination. They have told there's a group called Heart, and make sure I get the name right. It's Healing East Tennessee Alternative Response Team. This is a group of advocates who want the city to go to this alternative response program. The city's basically said, hey, if you want to set up a program like that and contract with us, come back with a proposal. And so the city's not itself really inclined to doing this. But anyway, these are the types of things that they're talking about doing. And
and one of the reasons that it's interesting that it's not an organization, all of these groups kind of came together to have this event is that we are in an election year, and in recent city elections, at least some of them, not the most recent one in 2021, but in 19 and 17, progressive coalitions have had some success in getting Councilwoman Amelia Parker elected, Councilwoman Seema Singh. They have had some traction with voters, and so this event obviously shows their effort. All these different but kind of related progressive groups, their effort to present a bit of a united front, both for the budget, but probably also help trying to set some of the agenda for the upcoming elections.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I don't. The one thing that and was raised at the event, and Brady talks about this a little bit in our interview with him, is it's really, it's essentially too late in the budget process to do anything. If you want to get anything done in the budget process, you've got to be talking to city officials, city council members, and all at least 6 to 8 months ahead before they consider the budget. They've already had first reading of the budget this time.
Right. And so this is as much a way to get some visibility for these issues as to have any sort of immediate impact. Well, let's go ahead to our interview and hear more about all of that from Brady Watson.
Our guest this week is Brady Watson. Brady was one of the organizers of the People's State of the City Forum. Welcome, Brady. Glad you joined us.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, glad to be here.
Okay, great. Well, we've talked about this briefly already. This was an event that was held last Wednesday. Tell us why that you and other community activist kind of folks and organizations decided that this was necessary.
Yeah, we feel like a budget for the city of Knoxville should be a community endeavor. Community input is important to any budget, especially if it's for a city government that provide services that impact, pretty much everyone in the city, whether it's, fire, public safety, roads, bridges, trash, that sort of thing. And so, from my perspective and our perspective, I think the public input portion of the budgeting process is definitely lacking. I know, the budget at this point is essentially already baked. I know that the mayor's probably been talking with department heads for the last 6 months or so, getting their priorities in line. And of course, we just saw the first sort of draft framework of the budget on April 26th at the mayor's State of the City event. And then council gets, essentially 2.5, 3 weeks to sort of digest it. And then usually after first reading, they have to vote on it again on second reading, of course. And they have another 2 weeks to basically get public input on what is, multi-million-dollar budget that is going to impact, like I said, everyone in the city. And so I think we wanted to have an opportunity for the public to kind of come forth and put forward their priorities for the city and sort of their budget wish list, if you will. I know the city does a public hearing it's going to be next week, but it's in the middle of the day on a weekday, and most working people are going to find that hard to attend. And like I said, I think from the limited amount of budget amendments that have happened in the past, it's very unlikely that the budget is going to change that much from when the mayor introduces it to where it's finalized. And so really, yeah, we just wanted to have a public space for the community to come together and express what they'd like to see in the budget, some of their priorities, some of the issues that, working class Knoxvillians are seeing in their neighborhoods, and kind of lay out their vision for the future of our city, to sort of compare, contrast with the mayor's. So that's what we try to do.
Well, do that a little for us. What, where do you compare and contrast? Where do the organizations participated in the People's State of the City Forum? Where do they align with what the mayor has proposed, or the vision that she has for the city, and where do they differ?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the main things we sort of had three big kind of asks that we'd like to see. I think the first one that's concerning to some folks was the fact that the Office of Community Safety and Community Empowerment are now merged under one office. It sounds like Charles Lomax's position is not going to be filled, so LaKenya Middlebrook will be doing essentially both of those jobs, although it looks like there are going to be 3 new full-time staff under administration, but I'm not clear on what those will look like. And the other issue that folks have is that those 2 offices, which were under, I believe, neighborhood development or a separate department, are now under administration. And so, say even if city council wanted to allocate funding for one of those offices, it would have to go through administration, which of course is the mayor's office. And so there's less latitude for council to actually amend the budget to give money to those 2 programs, in addition to the fact that that's now, essentially one person doing 2 people's jobs. I've also, it sounds like that the Title VI coordinator, which is there to assure any programs that receive federal funding are not discriminatory based on race or sex orientation, that position is not going to be filled, is what I've heard. That's obviously a concern. So that's one bucket. The second one is something that one of the groups, HEART, which is Healing East Tennessee Alternative Response Team, has been advocating for a number of years, which is an alternative response team to KPD. And that is essentially, if someone calls 911 for having a mental health crisis, mental health emergency, you would have an alternative response team, which could consist of a social worker or mental health professional that would respond to that call, as opposed to having law enforcement, which isn't really trained or equipped to handle that sort of situation. It's worked in other cities. I know that the folks at HEART have been trying to meet with the mayor and have been unsuccessful. I think they've met with Aaron Gill a few times, but it's a model that's worked. We've got a co-responder model now that I think is from my, somewhat limited knowledge, not based on best practices. And so that's a funding ask that we have. And the folks at HEART have said it would be less than, I think, $200,000 to do a pilot program just to test it out. That's kind of all they're asking for. And it seems like, that's something that could easily be done. But I think it sounds like the mayor's policy director, Aaron Gill, kind of shot that down during the first reading of the budget Tuesday. And so that's one ask we'd like to see. And then the other one is affordable housing. I think that's one good thing. Folks are happy with the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. That's dedicated funding for affordable housing. However, we don't think it's enough to meet the need. I think one thing, we saw at the mayor's State of the City address on the 26th was that Transforming Western, which is a pretty big development. It's going to lead to, I think, 470 affordable units over the course of the project. But, I think the latest count on homelessness was, 500 folks on the street now. And I think that's probably just not including the folks that are housing insecure, like our friend Breonna Holloway, who was at the event last night, who's been evicted and is really, really struggling to find housing right now. And I know that she's not alone. I think, y'all have seen the news, like Knoxville rent increased more than any other city in the country. And so there's really a crisis. And I don't think the level of funding is meeting the needs of that crisis. I think the funding from this year is actually slightly down from last year for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. So more housing is needed. I think I saw a statistic also that something like 90% of the units that have been built since 2012 have been luxury. And so there's just not a lot of affordable housing being built. And that's something we'd like to see the city fund more. I guess one other thing I'll throw out, the African American Equity Task Force, which I think is getting another staff position to try to find grants, which is great. However, the city has still not actually dedicated funding itself to fund that work. And so to me, if that was a priority, that was something that should be something they would do, I would think. The other big one is obviously policing. I think, we've got this ongoing police chief public records lawsuit with Knox News. And I think the finalists or the applicants were just released, which tells me that, that's something the mayor could have done a long time ago. I'm not sure why she's fought this long and has spent this much taxpayer dollars to fight that. But, the most recent incident with Lisa Edwards is just an indication to me that the culture at KPD is not changing, unfortunately. And that's something that starts at the top with the chief and ultimately with the mayor. And so those are a couple things I would highlight. Yeah.
Thinking about sort of timing and process, as you said, at this point in the budget cycle, it would be pretty unusual for anything major to change. And having an event like you did this week, like the timing is good in a certain sense in that everybody, or the people who pay attention to these things anyway, are paying attention to city budget right now because we're going through that process. But it's not necessarily the best time of year to actually impact at least this year's process, as you say. So is there any, and I know that like individual organizations probably have been, like you said, Hart has had meetings with people. Right. Is there any thought to trying to do something like this sort of, in 6 months in the fall or whatever, heading into the winter, where there might be more likelihood of kind of getting into the budget process at the front end?
Yeah, great question. I think that would be ideal. Yeah, I think one of the things, we haven't really had a debrief or follow-up from the event yet, but I think, and that's something we'd like to see the city do. Like the city could be holding public meetings, in November and December. I think the finance director mentioned that's really when the sort of process gets going and when priorities are illustrated. So I'd love to see the city do a real public input session prior to sort of when the sausage is made behind the scenes. But I think that's one thing we'd love to do is sort of have another public forum, like you said, in 6 months as we get closer to the actual formation of the next year's fiscal budget. I think, one thing that we're specifically asking for is, because again, the way that the budget has been restructured, if the community safety office is indeed going to be living under administration, one ask we have is that would be removed from administration, so there's a bit more flexibility. But if it's going to remain there, we'd love to see some funding put in I think it's the reserve fund, and then that way it could be reallocated to a program like an alternative response team or affordable housing after the fact. And so that's one sort of concrete ask we have. In addition to, like I said, more money for affordable housing, which that's something they could transfer from departments to do that as well. So, but yeah, to your question, I think that's something we'd look to do, and hopefully, I'd love to see the city do that. I'm not sure if they would, but in the meantime, yeah, we're going to encourage folks to come to the public hearing on the 9th. It's pretty indicative to me in the way that sort of things have been done, that it's during the middle of a working day when most people can't go. That just sort of tells you all you need to know, in my opinion. And then, yeah, we're going to encourage folks to show up on second reading on the 30th. I do think it's a move in the right direction that the second reading has been delayed. That gives council members more time to do, talk to their constituents, talk to folks in their community about their priorities. But yeah, so we'll see what happens.
Well, one thing you mentioned, you mentioned you hope that the city would be able to move funds around You mentioned moving some funds in that can be reallocated later. Where would those funds come from? Because one of the things they've got to do is have a balanced budget when it's approved. So, so where would that funding come from?
Yeah, good question. I think there are obviously a number of ways you could do it. The most sort of the best opportunity from our perspective is to move it from, KPD's budget, which has, I think, seen an increase around 30% since 2019. I think it's gone from like 59 million to 77 million, and there's been no increase in actual officers on the streets. So I'm not sure what that money is going toward. I think probably some of it's body cameras, but I think that would be our main ask, is that especially if you're going to fund something like an alternative response team, because I think most KPD officers would probably tell you they're not trained to handle mental health emergencies either. And so that seems like some common ground we could find if, rather than sort of, quote unquote, defunding the police, we just reallocate that money to an alternative response team that could actually take some of the burden off of KPD. And I know they've had a shortage of officers for a while, which leads to a lot of overtime pay and folks being overworked, and that makes them even more likely, to have incidents like we saw with Lisa Edwards, because if you're overworked, your sort of decision-making processes can take a hit. And so that would be one, pretty clear-cut way to do it, and fund something that could actually help take some of the burden off of KPD and help folks in our community who need that alternative response, quite frankly, someone that can help them, that has a mental health training, that has that social work background, to do that. And so that would be one source.
So broadening the focus a little bit beyond just the budget. Obviously, this is a city election year too, and the organizations who were at your event have been engaged in. Certainly, the city council movement has been engaged in recent elections. I'm just curious your sense of kind of the. I think we saw a lot of success for the city council movement, especially in 2019, 2017 as well. Less so kind of in the last cycle in 21. But I'm just curious, your sense of kind of how strong that progressive network is going to be heading into this year's elections, in terms of having people who can do door knocking for candidates, or even having candidates to support in some of these races.
Yeah, totally. I don't know if I have a great sense of that at this point. I think a lot of that remains to be seen. I don't think, beyond Amelia Parker, I don't think city council movement has endorsed anyone. I'm not sure if they will. So far in the mayor's race, you've got the incumbent India, and then India Kincannon, and then, Constance Every, of course, is the other sort of progressive challenger, but I'm not sure if city council movement will end up endorsing her or not. The other races, you've got Debbie Helsley running. I think she's gotten Change Tennessee's endorsement, which is another sort of progressive group that does local politics. I don't want to speculate too much on what city council movement's going to do in that race, if they'll endorse or not. You've got Cameron Brooks running again against Lynn Fugit. Again, I don't know if folks are going to get involved with that one. I know he's a former county party chair of the Democratic Party, but I think there's a lot of interest. I will say that. I think folks are, one of the maybe issues on the sort of progressive left is there's different groups doing different things and not coordinating too much. And so honestly, one of my hopes out of last night's event is that we maintain sort of that contact and continue to organize together and continue to try to push for candidates that we want to see that are actually going to implement some of these policy changes that we want to see. I know that folks are definitely coalesced around Amelia on that front, and I think folks are ready to, do what they can to help her get reelected. I think she is going to have a tight race with Matthew Best in particular. I know. I'm sure y'all saw Matt Shears, the county party chair, donated to Matthew Best, and I think there's sort of that's going to be an interesting race to see how that plays out. But yeah, I'm not sure about the other races. I think, the mayor's races sort of remains to be seen. The other council races, I'm not super sure how that's going to play out. I have some, I guess personal preferences and things like that, but I can't speak for, I guess the progressive movement writ large.
Right. Well, as you say, it's not like super tightly or centrally organized.
Right.
Well, moving, this move. It isn't organized, but there is kind of a common thread through a lot of this, and that is, to me, that the city is falling short in helping the least. The least among us, as we say, the people who are have housing difficulties, especially
right.
Mentally ill, people who are going through a crisis and that sort of thing. Is that something that you think that the candidates that the participants in this event would be supportive of? I mean, is that the key issue that they see?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And one of the things, frankly, that was most sort of jarring and striking to me about the mayor's speech on the 26th was she mentioned something about, quality of life is improving for Knoxvillians, even the most vulnerable communities or something like that, which is, patently false. The Black poverty rate is higher than it's ever been, and, something like 42 or higher percent. And so, and of course, the housing situation is probably worse than it's ever been too. Our houseless population, I think, is growing, and I know firsthand folks are struggling to find housing, and so those are two issues that it seems to be at odds with her sort of portrayal of the city. And I do think, yes, the folks that were at the event, people say the city budget event, are definitely concerned about sort of the most marginalized people in our communities, because those are the folks that are reliant on city services the most, right? Like those are the people that need those services, and our city administration, city council to actually provide the resources needed, because, we can get into a long sort of, you can talk about federal investment or state investment, but our state is not investing in those programs either. The federal government on the past few years under the Biden administration has done some with the pandemic, but, there are a lot of gaps, and people are falling through the gaps. And it's really unfortunate to see a lot of the most marginalized folks, the most vulnerable folks are susceptible to that. And I think that's why a candidate like Amelia has pretty broad support on the left, because she is one to, stand up and show up for those communities most often. And she'll speak out, on issues on council where matters of funding and resources are brought up, because I think she's got a track record of trying to provide resources for those groups, those most marginalized groups, whether they be people of color, houseless folks, mentally ill folks, or any of those things. And so, if there was a candidate that was, proudly working class, low income Black Knoxville, I think that would be someone that folks would happily get behind. And like I said, beyond Amelia, I don't know if there's a clear consensus among sort of the progressive groups and in that sort of section that would get behind, but we'll see.
What would be the strategy for convincing, I guess, the general population, the entire population of Knoxville of the positions that that these organizations are advocating? I know it's not one single position. We know that.
Yeah.
If there are 10 groups, there are 10 or 11 groups that were there, I think. Had slightly different positions, but what will it take to or what strategies do you think that will need to be taken to make that give it a broader appeal?
Yeah. I mean, I sort of like to think of people as being mostly good and like see the best in people. And I think you can make a case to folks that, these people that are going through these crises, whether they be mental health or housing or health, it could just as easily be someone you love, right? Like it could be your father, your brother, your sister, and, some religious connotation, the least of these, as you mentioned, like, whether you're a Christian or a Muslim or practice Judaism, I think there's lots of through lines through all of the major religions that we try to take care of the most vulnerable citizens in our society. And so I think that's one kind of through line you can make. Like these people, we take care of one another. I think there is a sense of community in Knoxville that you could tap into. And it's also just a benefit for everyone. Like we all do better when we all do better. And, no one, I don't think likes to see homeless people on the streets, folks don't like to see that. I think it's harmful, obviously, for the people that are going through it, but it also has impacts on the rest of the city, and makes some people might have concerns about safety and things of that nature. But if you address that issue, you're housing people, you don't have to worry about folks on the streets. You can worry less about people safety, getting hit by cars, walking around on the streets. You don't have to worry about people being exposed to the elements. And it's a lot easier to just keep folks housed on the front end than it is to provide services after they become homeless. And so I think it could even you can make a financial argument too. If we invest in housing on the front end and keep people housed from before they become homeless, we're saving money in the long run. The other thing too, I think there's a lot of sort of, maybe not as broad, but people, think that police officers are overburdened and overworked and perhaps underpaid. And so if you could provide that sort of an alternative response model, that would take some of the pressure off of police officers and actually get them, there are violent crimes to respond to, and they could be responding to those types of things as opposed to men or folks that are experiencing homelessness. And so, I think there are a number of things you could try to tap into there that would, either from an emotional perspective, a financial perspective, or just like a general well-being of our city perspective that could be persuasive to folks. That being said, I think local elections are tough, right? There's, aside from y'all, there's not a whole lot of local coverage on local elections. There's not a ton of media attention. And our turnout rate is very low too, right? Like 20% of registered voters typically vote in city elections. And so in the one hand, it's an opportunity because that means the margins are small and you can actually make a difference. But at the same time, it's hard to actually turn people out to vote because there's a lot going on in people's everyday lives. And there's just not that much coverage on local elections. And so it's a multi-pronged issue, I guess I would say.
All right. Well, that's probably a good place to wrap up. And we will certainly stay in touch with you and these other organizations, both through the budget as we move through the elections. And we appreciate you giving us a few minutes of your time.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. I appreciate you guys covering and always appreciate your work. So thank you.
All right. Well, thanks again to Brady for talking with us, and of course, be interesting to see, what if anything comes out of those progressive quarters as the year goes on. Mm-hmm. Looking ahead to the coming week, Knox County Mayor Glenn Jacobs. It's his turn to talk about budgets. We've had Marianne Kincannon make her budget presentation. The school board passed its proposed budget. Mayor Jacobs, Monday at 11 a.m. in the main assembly room of the City County building, will be making his proposed county budget public for the 23-24 fiscal year. That budget incorporates, of course, the school system budget, which is the biggest part of it, 60+%, but also includes general county functions, the sheriff's office, and so forth. And I think that all the indications are that this is sort of like the city budget that we saw, apart from the school system, which, of course, we have talked about is getting a big bump in state funding. But as far as the rest of the county budget goes, I think everybody's anticipating it's going to be pretty flat. A lot of concern about potential for recession later in the year. So we probably won't see a lot of fireworks in the budget that gets presented. I think the one thing that is going to come out of this, and we wrote about this and talked about it a few weeks ago, is that Sheriff Tom Spangler is likely to challenge the county budget allocation to the sheriff's office. He put in a budget request this year for a 30% raise for his deputies, which would be a big jump. I don't think that a budget that is going to be mostly flat is going to have room for a 30% raise for sheriff's officers and corrections officers. And he has, Spangler has held out the possibility of filing a contested salary suit, which if and when this happens, we'll talk a little bit more about what those are and how they work. But it would basically be him going, he couldn't do it until after County Commission actually approves the budget, which won't happen until the end of the month or early June. But basically it would be Spangler going and suing and saying that the county is not providing sufficient funds for him to execute his constitutional duties. And if that happens, we're going to be in, everybody throws around the phrase uncharted territory. We're going to be in uncharted territory.
Yeah.
This would legitimately be a good use of that cliche, because nobody who I've talked to can remember this ever actually happening before, where a sheriff in Knox County, there have been some cases around the state, but where a sheriff in Knox County has actually challenged the county and sued for more money, essentially. If he did that, if he was successful, could that potentially if a judge says, yes, the county has to fund this at this level, could that force a tax increase? I don't know. It probably depends on how big that number is, but if it's big enough that it would, where the options are either a tax increase or some draconian cuts elsewhere in the budget, that might be the options that the county's facing. So we don't know if any of that'll happen, but I think after this announcement on Monday and after the sheriff's response to this announcement on Monday is when we'll get an indication of whether that fight is something we're really going to see. And so then later in the week, we go back to talking about the city budget, right?
Yes, on Tuesday. We've talked about civics education. If you want a civics education, Tuesday from 8 o'clock in the morning until after 6 o'clock in the evening, you can attend the city budget hearings.
Come keep Scott company. He's going to be lonely.
Keep me awake. Bring me coffee. What happens in these is it is a city council meeting. It's a public hearing, and administration officials go in one by one throughout the day, explaining the budget that they are requesting for their departments, answering any questions that council members might have, and they go through, like I said, I mean, it's every single department. The police department goes through, the fire department goes through, the economic development department goes through, the engineering department goes through, the parks and recreation goes through, all the organizations that aren't necessarily part of the city, but the city supports, like the Knoxville Chamber. All these groups go through, and as I said, talk about their appropriation under the budget, answer questions that the council members might have about what they do, why they need this money, and that sort of thing.
It can be actually a very good education in city government. If you just want to kind of know, because it is so comprehensive, it's kind of like if you want to know everything that the city of Knoxville does and the major partners who they work with, you sit through this, you're going to hear from all of them. And sort of each department comes and does a little dog and pony show. Here's what we do. Here's why we're great. Here's what we're going to do with the new money next year, all of that.
Yeah. It's kind of fun. It's kind of, we were both kind of grinning about, the civics lesson that you get, but you really do. I mean, it's really interesting. You see, and you do get an idea of how complex it can be, the manifold things that the city government actually does. and what it takes to do it. I mean, it's not, especially in a city like Knoxville, and Knoxville's not unique in this, but these functions of the city government require, professional leadership. They require, a lot of juggling a lot of interests, and sometimes, and different governments do. Knoxville's no different. They do some things better than others, and that sort of thing. But you really do get an idea of what a complex and constantly kind of moving beast, city government can be, and it is real. It is a real eye opener. Now, after the end of the official presentations, there is going to be a public hearing. So,
what time does that start?
I believe it's 6:00, maybe 5:30. Would have to double check. One thing that you can do if you are interested, and especially if you're interested in one sector of the budget as opposed to another, like if you want to know what time the police department is going to present their things, or the or whatever department or whatever area you're interested in, if you go to the city's website, which is knoxvilletn.gov, and you click on City Council, and then go to their agenda page, the agenda and the schedule is laid out there, and department and office by department and office. I mean, you'll have a really good idea of, if you do want to, and I believe it's going to be on the community television as well. So if you want to tune in at whatever time your area of interest is going to be, you can do that. But and you can check out then about the time. But I believe it's 6:00. And who knows how long public forum will last. My understanding is, of course, the folks who were at the People's State of the City address the other night, they were encouraging people there to go to the budget hearing, and also going to second reading of the budget. Now, one thing that's new about this is the city council members can take this information, and they've already delayed second reading, which would have normally been the following Tuesday. They've delayed it to May 30th, and if council members want to propose any changes to the budget, now they can't make line item changes. They can only do this at the departmental level or the fund level, but if they want to propose any changes, they'll have time to formulate those amendments to bring on the 30th. But the 30th is when the second and final reading will be. So,
all right.
And
then later in the week, we have Planning Commission.
And we can't avoid talking about the city budget even when we talk about the Planning Commission, because on Thursday the Planning Commission will, as they have to do under the city charter, consider and approve the capital improvements program for the city. And these are the big picture, the big construction,
urban wilderness stuff. And
we got street paving, all those kinds of things, roof repair and HVAC system replacement and those kinds of things, those one-time expenditures, frequently paid for, not always, frequently paid for through bond issues and that sort of thing. The Planning Commission has to approve that, and it's generally a routine thing. It's not, I've not heard any complaints or about the capital improvements program, and usually there aren't very, very many. There might be, if you're doing something major like the public safety center, that complex rather, that's something that could but there aren't any really in this year's budget. I mean, most of this year's budget is going to be maintenance type things, and so I don't anticipate there will be big controversy over the capital improvements program. There are a couple other things the Planning Commission is going to be doing. One is the large, small town size development in North Knox County called Belltown that we've talked about many times before. Your concept plans coming back before Planning Commission in light of transportation analysis that has been done. The analysis is, basically if the improvements they're talking about making are made, then everything will be hunky-dory. Well, I wouldn't say hunky-dory, but it's a generally positive thing, but it is predicated on things being done.
Right. Improvements on Emory Road.
Yeah, improvements on Emory. Yes, Emory Road, and also in one of the things is at Clinton Highway. There at Emory Road and Clinton Highway, they're really concerned about a lot of traffic backing up there and being at certain times of the day, but anyway, they're going to be considering that. There are a couple other things that are going on. There's a fairly large development. It's a 70-acre, especially for the city. It's a 70-acre development out at the end of Buffett Mill Road near Easttown, the former Easttown Mall area, and it's going to be about 290 lots on this. Originally, that they were wanting to put in duplexes as part of the whole idea of increasing density and things like that. That's kind of been scrapped. They're going to single family houses now, but it's a large development out there. The people that live in the Alice Bell Spring Hill neighborhood are concerned about traffic and runoff and the things that neighbors at these kinds of sites typically are concerned about.
Sure.
And that has been delayed. That project has been delayed several times. So while I'm saying that they're going to be considering that, don't be surprised if if you tune in or go to the meeting and it gets delayed in that time.
We all know that heartbreak of showing up for the public meeting and that one thing that you really want to hear about has been deferred for a month. It's always very sad.
Yeah, it's especially sad for us because a lot of times
that's what we're planning.
This is what we're planning to write about, and there's nothing else worth writing about. And then we're going to have to go, oh my goodness, we've got to shift gears in a matter of hours. But that's what makes our job fun.
One other thing I think we should mention there about planning, which we didn't talk about earlier, but we did also find out this past week that basically all of the proposed changes to the structure of the planning department that we talked about last year on the podcast and that we've written about, where the city and county were each going to take sort of their own planning staffs out of the existing planning staff, and they would then be city and county employees, and then some people would stay under planning because they have some other functions that aren't strictly to the city or the county, blah, 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 blah. None of that's happening. That's just forget it. We're going back to the planning commission, the planning department, the way that it has been running as a joint city-county entity that is, a self-contained agency that serves both of them. Amy Brooks, who was the executive director of Knox County Planning and had left last year to go to the city of Knoxville, where she was going to be working on what was supposed to be their in-house planning department, and then the city kind of didn't get their act together, I think is the best way to put it, to create that. She left there to then go to Knox County to head up their internal planning functions. She is now coming back to be executive director of Knox County Planning, which is what she was when this whole rondelay started. And those planning employees who had gone to the county are now going to come back with her and be folded back in. and everybody's just going to pretend that we didn't.
Nothing ever happened.
We talked about this at all.
The last 6 months did not happen.
I think there's a lot of reasons for this kind of structurally. I mean, it was really that the city ran into some problems with trying to set things up the way that they were thinking of setting them up, and that kind of delayed everything. And Jeff Welch, who has been serving as the head of Knox County Planning, he's going to be retiring later in the year. They were going to have to replace him anyway. And I think there was some concern about it would be hard to hire somebody into that job in the reduced capacity that they had now kind of put it in. And also, obviously, they all like Amy Brooks because she keeps going. Yeah, she keeps getting hired from everybody. First, both mayors together named her head of Knox County Planning, and then each of them separately hired her to go work for them. So I think basically everybody's okay with her continuing to run it, and we're just going to continue on with planning the way we have known it.
Yeah, it's and really, they were having a hard time, but the city and the county, I think, having a hard time explaining why they thought that was necessary.
Yeah,
because because the Planning Commission itself was going to stay as one joint city-county commission, and they already have staff members who pretty much divide up, city stuff and county stuff because the zoning codes are different.
Right, you have to know the different codes and everything.
The planning commissioners, they do a good job of telling the planning commissioners, making sure they know the difference between, if there is a difference between something the city does and the county, then they explain, they do a good job of that, of making sure that they know, okay, you can do this in the county, but you can't do it in the city, or vice versa.
Well, I think it's kind of a classic example of the if it ain't broke, don't fix it thing. I mean, this was an example where they didn't identify any really specific problems they were trying to solve with this. And so they tried a fix that just kind of confused everybody. I think they've all decided, let's just leave it alone. Okay, well, that's it for this week. We will be back next week. Certainly we'll be talking about the county budget, whatever comes out of those council hearings, and, of course, anything else that happens. Thanks, as always, to Seth Barber for his production work at Barbarian Studios. Our theme music is by Will Wright, and I think it is just about margarita time. Talk to you later.
Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And many thanks to William Wright for composing our theme song. Compass Points is a partnership of Barking Shark Media and Barbarian Productions, and recorded by Lord Seth A. Barber at Barbarian Studios, Knoxville, Tennessee.